Good morning, everyone. It is presently Tuesday, October 27th, 2020 at 5 a.m., or 0500 for those of you who use a 24-hour clock. Today we shall be reading Unintended Consequences, a novel by John Ross, Part 2I, Growth Continued. For this recording session, we shall pick up at the start of Chapter 77, Amnesty, November 2nd, 1968. In the digital PDF version of this book, this section begins at the start of page 231. This section begins on page 270 of the softcover print edition, for those of you who are wondering. Now then, without further ado, let us begin. Unintended Consequences, a novel by John Ross, Part 2I, Growth Continued, Chapter 77, Amnesty, November 2nd, 1968. You headed down to the foundry again? Catherine Bowman asked as Henry excused himself from the dinner table. You've been down there all weekend. I've got more cutting and numbering to do, Mom, Henry said cheerfully. This thing's going to be a one-shot deal, assuming it's not a trap. You sure you don't need me to sign my name to these pieces of muffler pipe you're cutting up? Catherine Bowman joked. She found it most amusing that Henry was so adamant about how he was going to need her to become a gun dealer under these new laws that were coming. No, I don't think so. Just don't get me thrown in jail, all right, dear? She said with a laugh. The idea that the federal government might arrest a middle-aged woman for agreeing to do this was, of course, utterly absurd. I'll try not to, Henry Bowman said, then ran down the basement stairs to his late father's workshop to wear out some more hacksaw blades. Henry's well-focused vigor was understandable. One of the provisions of the 1968 Gun Control Act was that interstate commerce in all firearms was now going to be heavily restricted. Dealers were now going to have to be federally licensed and would not be able to sell to purchasers under the age of 18 for long guns and 21 for handguns. In conjunction with many other restrictions soon to go into effect under the 1968 Gun Control Act, the government was promising a 30-day amnesty where National Firearms Act weapons could be registered live without payment of the normal $200 tax. After the month-long amnesty period was up, however, there would be no provision to register any weapon that was not in the system. Going one step further, non-functional weapons were soon to be registerable items under the 1968 Act. It would no longer be possible for a citizen to take the internal parts out of his Thompson submachine gun to render it inoperable and expect to be left alone by the authorities. Given that many people thought the amnesty might be a trap, this set of circumstances posed a real dilemma to shooters like Henry Bowman, who had large numbers of non-taxed NFA weapons. If the amnesty was a trap, every gun he registered would be destroyed by the feds. If the amnesty was legitimate, however, then every gun he did not register would be one he wouldn't be able to take out and shoot ever again, for it would be considered contraband. Henry was fairly sure the amnesty was not an immediate trap, but there was another thing to consider. There were no guarantees as to what would happen in the future, and confiscation was always preceded by registration. Anyone with any knowledge of history knew this. Henry Bowman, because of the personal experiences of those in his family, was considerably better versed than most people on what governments were capable of doing when left unchecked. That was why, even if President Lyndon B. Johnson himself had given him a document on presidential stationery stating that the amnesty registration was on the level, Henry Bowman was not about to submit all of his machine guns and cannons for governmental approbation. Henry Bowman had spent a lot of time thinking about what to do. Since the amnesty involved guns owned before the passage of the 1968 Act, it did not have an age minimum, and Henry therefore did not have to involve his mother in the registration process. In the end, he had settled on a plan of action that he thought covered all the eventualities in the best possible way. Henry had decided to register 6 machine guns. His .30-06 Colt Monitor, a 1918 A2 Browning automatic rifle, a .45 caliber 1928 Thompson submachine gun, a 9mm Sten gun, a .303 caliber Bren gun, and a .30 caliber model 1917 built-fed Browning water-cooled machine gun. These 6 machine guns were the ones he shot most, and if the Amnesty was not a trap, these were the ones he wanted to be able to use every weekend and during the summer without problems. He had a second example of 5 of them held in reserve in case of confiscation. Henry did not have a duplicate monitor, but since he owned 2 other BAR variants which used the same magazines, he felt he was covered. He had 23 other machine guns of various types that he did not shoot very often, and these he was not going to register either, under any circumstances. In amending the National Firearms Act of 1934, the 1968 Federal Firearms Act also reclassified military weapons with bores over a ½ inch into a newly created destructive device category, which also required registration. Henry planned to register the 20mm Lottie he had recently bought, and let the Solotherm S18-1000 his father had given him remain a free market weapon. Both guns fired the same ammunition, and Henry made his choice based mainly on the fact that the Solotherm had a quick-change barrel, which meant it could be broken down without tools into manageable pieces for discreet storage, while the Lottie, by contrast, was 9 feet long and would stay that way. What Henry had been working on the last few days involved the third area covered by the Amnesty, namely firearms silencers. A $200 tax on a machine gun was very high, but a $200 tax levied on what was essentially a muffler for a lawnmower was utterly ridiculous. Henry Bowman had only heard of one person in his entire life who had actually paid the $200 tax to the federal government to make his gun quieter. Virtually all registered silencers were owned by National Firearms Act dealers who paid $200 a year to deal in NFA weapons and who were thus exempt from the per-unit tariff. Henry fully intended to become an NFA dealer, but he knew he had to wait until his 21st birthday. He had already checked up on that. The Amnesty was going to allow registration of silencers without having to pay the tax, during the 1-month window. That was why Henry was spending a great deal of time cutting and putting serial numbers on various diameters and lengths of stainless steel aircraft tubing. He had decided that 50 would probably suffice for a lifetime supply, given his high-volume shooting habits. The outer tubes were what was important. He could make the internals up later, as they were needed. Stainless steel was a lot harder to cut than mild steel, and Henry was soon sweating again. Christ! Henry said to himself, cutting off pieces of aircraft tubing and stamping numbers on them all weekend because it's the only time in history when you don't have to pay the feds $200 for each one. His hands began to sweat, so he gripped the saw more tightly to compensate. Is this a fucking joke or what? Henry thought for perhaps the 100th time as he drew the saw back and forth and watched the blade slowly make its way through the 2-inch seamless tubing. New chapter here. Chapter 78. Propositioned for Cheatin'. February 8th, 1969. Hey, get your own french fries. Jesus, Bowman, don't have a cow. I was only taking one. Well, take one from somebody else, Kurth. If you're too cheap to cough up a quarter and buy your own. I'll keep your damn french fries. They're no good here anyway. Jimmy Kurth was a notorious mooch, but it was mainly an act. He was absolutely fearless when it came to talking to girls, and because of that, his friends overlooked his minor shortcomings. Oh, don't whine at me, Henry said. I told you we should have gone to Steak and Shake, but you guys aren't happy unless the cooks salt the piss out of everything, and you get to eat off of cardboard instead of china. Very funny, asshole. Hey, Henry, Bill Presler called from one of the other booths. Come here a minute, would you? Need your help on something. Henry Bowman shoved the last of the salty french fries into his mouth and slid off the vinyl-covered bench seat. What's up? Sit down. Here, you want some fries? I'm full. Wonder what he wants. And wonder who this older guy with him is. Dick, this is Henry Bowman, the guy I was telling you maybe could help you out. Dick Gaines, the older boy said, looking a little uncomfortable as he shook Henry's hand across the Formica tabletop. Henry could tell Gaines was embarrassed about something. Bill Presler took charge of the situation. You see, Dick here goes to school with my brother Gordon over at Hilldale, which means that Dick is probably a dumb shit, Henry thought to himself. Now Dick's got the SAT coming up, Bill went on, and he doesn't do so good on tests. Now it's been confirmed, Henry thought silently, as he put a concerned expression on his face and nodded for his friend to continue. I told him he ought to talk to you. Can you help me out? Gaines asked, feeling embarrassed at the entire situation, and especially the fact that this new kid was younger than he. Bill here says you took it a year early and aced it. Henry shook his head. Look, I don't think I can help with something like that, especially since it's in, 2 weeks? Gaines broke in quickly. Oh, that's no problem. I can get all the stuff made up in 3 days, 5 tops. What on earth is he talking about? Henry wondered at this odd assertion. Well, even if you can, the SAT isn't something you can really cram for. You can try to learn the vocabulary for the English part, and that'll help some, but 2 weeks isn't much time. He took a deep breath and went on. The math section, well, either you can do arithmetic or you can't. Simple as that. I don't think I can teach you the math part in 2 weeks if you're really weak there. Now, what I can do, Henry said, warming to the subject, is teach you to see the way the test writers think, which is a big part of being able to get all the way through the test before time is called, and something that anyone with half a brain can see after reading the first 2 or 3 questions. He wanted to add, but left out. The most important thing is... No, you're missing the point. Bill Presler broke in. Dick doesn't want a tutor. That's not going to be enough, especially not now with 2 weeks left, just as you said. Then, how can I help him out? Take the test for me. Henry's mouth opened as he stared at Dick Gaines. He was dumbfounded. Gaines went on quickly. That's all you gotta do. Walk into the center, show the right ID, sit down and take the test for me. You remember what it was like. A whole bunch of kids you don't know showing up at a place you've never been to before. A couple hours easy work and you'll be out of there scot-free, right? Henry didn't know what to say. Getting a ringer to take the SAT for you. Jesus Christ, who the fuck is this guy? He thought. Ought to call himself Dickhead Gaines. Despite this reaction, Henry's mind instinctively went to analyzing the obstacles to pulling off such a plan. Well, the main problem would be the ID. When I took it last year, I wasn't 16 yet, so I used a copy of my birth certificate. Everyone else had a driver's license, though, and I think if someone who was supposed to be 17 or 18 like you tried to say he couldn't drive a car, they'd look real close at him. Hey, I said that's no problem. I can get a real driver's license for you, not a fake one. Your picture on it, my name, address, and birth date. Henry thought about that for a moment. Yeah, sure. I go in the license bureau, say I'm you and lost my license. They look up your address, take a new picture, and mail you off the new license. Since we're under 21, it can't be a liquor scam, and high school kids don't have any other ID anyway. So what are they going to ask for as proof? A note from your mother? Guys must pull that trick all the time for their underage brothers. Sometimes even for friends, if they really trust them. Except I'm 4 inches shorter than you are, and you got blonde hair. They're sure to spot that. And even if they didn't, we still wouldn't get the thing in 2 weeks. Not even if we went for the picture tomorrow. Why the hell am I even talking about this stupid idea? Henry asked himself. Gaines was impressed at how quickly Henry had realized how to get a real driver's license issued with someone else's picture on it. You'd be right about the clerk spotting the different description and the time it would take, he said with a broad smile. Except for one thing. My dad owns the license office. I can fill the forms in myself, stamp his signature on it, and tell him I need immediate turnaround. 5 days tops. Richard Gaines looked very smug. Henry frowned. How can your dad own a driver's license office? He immediately demanded. Those are state offices. Missouri state government owns and operates them. Henry was thinking about all the times he had gone with his father and waited while surly workers had taken their time waiting on them. The first time he had gone by himself to license his 1964 Chevy 2 Super Sport, the delay had been even worse. Dick Gaines was almost laughing now, and shaking his head happily. No, my dad owns one. The state owns the land and the building, but he owns the business. He gets the money from license fees. I can do all the paperwork for the new driver's license tonight. Henry Bowman ignored this last comment. He wanted to know more about this license office setup. So, if the state owns the land and the building, how does somebody get to own a driver's licensing office? He asked. Simple. The governor appoints them, Richard Gaines said proudly. So that's it, Henry thought. Another damn political scam, eh? Fits right in with our new Missouri vehicle inspection law, too, where you get to hang around a gas station for 2 hours waiting for a gangly kid with bad skin to take your money so he can tell you that your horn, turn signals, and brakes are working. His thoughts returned to the licensing office. I wonder what the governor got out of this asshole's dad for that little gold mine. More than a pardon? Shit. Most Missourians and everyone with politicians or newsmen in their families knew that Democratic governors in Missouri sold pardons. Trial lawyers found this practice especially irritating when the governor charged less than they did, as was the case currently, but there was little they could do about it. Yeah, you could say that. My dad's good friends with the governor, Gaines lied. This guy talks too damn much, Henry thought. He had no intention of taking the SAT test for anyone, but there was no way in hell he would ever do it for Dick Gaines. Look, I have to tell you, I'm not wild about this idea. There may not be much chance of getting caught, but if something happened and I did, I'd be up shit creek. Well, so would I, Gaines said immediately. Henry snorted. Yeah, but you're fucked right now. Your grades are lousy and you're gonna bomb on the one test every college uses to level out the applicants from different schools. You gotta take some risk. I don't. In fact, I don't need this shit at all. Richard Gaines was used to being talked to this way from his father, but not from someone he barely knew, and who was 2 years his junior. He didn't like it at all, and he wanted to get up and leave. But he was desperate. Look, I know that. Hey, I came to you, right? Listen, we can work something out. I'd be willing to pay you. Oh, did you originally hope to find someone who'd do it as a favor? Henry thought sarcastically. But I'm not going to pay someone unless I know he's going to come through. Trying to take control of this conversation, are we? That's not a problem, Henry said easily. I'm very performance-oriented. I'll guarantee you at least 1,500 combined score. That also means each will be over 700. The math will probably be higher than the verbal. Henry's mind was working quickly to come up with terms that would be impossible for Gaines to agree to. 1,500? Like here he thought for a few moments. A 750 on both? No one in Richard Gaines's high school had ever earned scores anywhere near that high. Yeah, or 715, 785, or whatever. 1,500 combines the minimum. Any less, you get $200. Huh? Gaines said. Henry's last comment had made no sense to him. Soon as we agree to do this, I go to the bank and get a cashier's check payable to you for $200 and put it in an envelope with your money, Henry explained. A lawyer holds the envelope and can't release it unless we're both there. When the test scores come back, we go see him. 1,500 or higher, you tell him to give it to me. If I pull, say, 750, 730, then I tell him to hand it to you. Richard Gaines was adjusting to the concept that he might make $200 while having 700 plus scores credited to him when he realized that Henry had not yet stated his fee. How much does my check have to be for? He said finally. $2 a point, based on the minimum. That's $3,000. Have a cashier's check for it by 6 o'clock Monday night. If that's too much or too soon, go get somebody else to do it. $3,000? Richard Gaines yelled. Several tables of the people in nearby booths turned to look at him. Are you out of your fucking mind? He added in an intense whisper. When Bill Presler had offered to introduce him to Henry Bowman, Gaines had hoped he could talk the kid into taking the test for a $20 bill. Not at all, Henry said amiably. Do you know what I could buy with $3,000? Gaines continued in a slightly more measured tone. Oh, you bet I do, Henry thought immediately. You could buy a clean clip-wing Cub, stressed for aerobatics, just like mine. Or you could buy a 3-year-old 427 Corvette and a Korean War power wagon with a ring mount. Or maybe Inter Armco's entire inventory of 20mm Solotherm ammo. $3,000's pretty cheap considering what 4 years at a good college costs, Henry explained. And I have to risk ending up where you are right now. Now you, on the other hand, he finished the sentence with a shrug. SAT makes the difference, and you know it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have come looking for me. Henry saw the older boy's expression change and realized with astonishment that Gaines was thinking about what he had said. Jesus Christ, he's buying this crap, Henry thought in disbelief. Before 6 o'clock Monday, Henry said as he slid out of the booth and stood to leave. Bill here can give you my phone number so I can tell you where the lawyer's office is. Since if you ask me now, I wouldn't have the faintest idea of what lawyer would want to hold an envelope for a couple of high school kids. Let me know one way or the other. He walked out the door, waving goodbye to Jimmy Keith as he went out the door. Henry was grinning as he stepped into the parking lot. He was remembering the look on Gaines's face when he had named his fee. Couldn't have pulled a needle out of his ass with a tractor. Max Collins used the phrase occasionally. Henry thought it was very appropriate. Well, after that little talk, there ought to be some good gossip around school come Monday, Henry told himself with a smile. As it turned out, there wasn't. What would happen on Monday would be much more interesting. New chapter here. Chapter 79. Laws of Power. February 10th, 1969. We are presently at the start of page 237 of the ebook edition and page 276 of the softcover print edition. Continuing now. Henry, there's someone here to see you, Catherine Bowman called to her son after she had opened the front door. Go on upstairs, she told the visitor. His room's on the right. Richard Gaines quickly made his way to Henry Bowman's bedroom. He found Henry sitting at a wide desk. Above it on the wall was a framed photo of a green and white biplane about 100 feet off the ground, pointed almost straight down and obviously about to crash. Henry had several textbooks open on the desk, and was bent over a piece of graph paper, making fine marks on it. He did not raise his head but held up a finger, indicating that his visitor should wait silently for a moment. Richard did not know it, but Henry was calculating extended trajectory curves for his heart-barreled .224 Clark varmint rifle, based on the range results he had achieved the day before at 1, 2, and 300 yards. Sorry about that, my head was full of numbers I didn't want to lose. He was startled to see Dick Gaines standing in the doorway. Come on in. The older boy closed the door behind him and got to the point. Look, I've only got 1,100 right now. That's all I could get in 2 days, but it's in cash, and I'll have the rest before you go in to take the test. Henry shook his head. It's almost 8:30, he said, nodding towards the clock on the wall. I said by 6. Jesus Christ, what's 2 hours? Richard Gaines pleaded. Look, you don't have to do the $200 deal, okay? He offered. I know you'll do great, just take the test for me, okay? Henry shook his head. Have I wandered into the Twilight Zone? I've got to come up with something that'll get rid of this fucking moron. He smiled sadly and said, I'm afraid you don't understand. After 6 p.m., it was the next guy in line's turn. He's already come with the money, so I've been hired. And no matter what kind of IDs you can come up with, there's no way I can be 2 people at the same time. Sorry. Richard Gaines looked crestfallen. He nodded his head and turned to leave. Henry Bowman opened his mouth as Richard Gaines walked out the door, then shut it when he realized he had nothing more to say. Henry didn't go back to the trajectory tables that night. Some vague beliefs he had instinctively held had just been magnified 100-fold in his mind. It would be years before he would be able to put them into words, but they had already taken deep root. Always deal from a position of strength. When opportunity presents itself, seize it. Take control of a situation and others will follow you, even when it is not in their best interest to do so. Political power begets corruption, but the most important lesson was the one that Henry had already learned from the events of his canoe trip the previous summer. Always know when to walk away. New chapter here. Chapter 80. Dusk on Safari. June 1st, 1969. We are at the start of page 238 of the ebook edition and page 277 of the softcover print edition. I'll have to edit this a lot. Okay. Continuing now. June 1st, 1969. He's magnificent, but I'm afraid as soon as we stalk closer, he'll be in the woods. The wind isn't in our faces and might change. Best to find another herd rather than waste time on this one. Raymond Johnson lowered his binoculars. By the time we do that, it'll be dark. I don't mind quitting for the day, but let's think about this for just a minute, Max Collins replied. His eyes scanned the area around where they stood. Not a fucking thing I could use for a rest around here. He looked at Raymond and at the 2 trackers that were with him. Roll up a couple of shirts, that wouldn't be but 3 inches high, and that's not enough to keep the grip cap out of the dirt. His eyes came to rest on a patch of ground that was very slightly higher than the surrounding area. That might get me above the weeds, he thought. Max Collins slid his left arm through the military sling and tightened it around his upper bicep as he knee-walked to the place he had picked out. The guide saw what he was doing and spoke up immediately. Max, that's a 400-yard shot, and I don't think... Closer to 450. Collins interrupted as he went from a kneeling position to one flat on his stomach. Unless the one is normal size and all the others are stunted. Ray Johnson opened his mouth to say something, then shut it. Max Collins had made a perfect shot on a warthog that morning. Ray was not about to insult a client on the first day of his safari. The trackers could use some night practice anyway. The big man stared out at the distant herd of great kudu, looking for clues as to the speed of the wind. Almost none this late. Just a kiss from the left, he decided with satisfaction. Then Collins worked himself into the same prone position he had used to place third in the Wimbledon Cup 1,000-yard match in the late 1930s. His feet were spread, and his spine, when viewed from above, made a 25-degree angle with the axis of the rifle barrel. Collins's elbows pressed into the dry earth, supporting his upper body, and the sling bit into his left arm as the tension on it increased. The two trackers looked at Ray Johnson and scowled. The professional hunter did not normally let anyone take such a long shot, especially when the game was standing right next to the woods, and certainly not half an hour before dusk. Tracking a wounded animal in the dark was much harder, and their employer did not believe in letting injured game get away and take days to die. They looked at each other and resigned themselves to being up the entire night. The gray animal with the spiral horns that faced the four men was Africa's version of a bull elk. The kudu did not come close to filling the scope's field of view at this long distance, but Max Collins could see that he was indeed a huge example of the species. The rifleman put the crosshairs at a spot he judged to be 32 inches above and 6 inches to the left of the kudu's heart, took a deep breath, let it out, and began to squeeze the trigger. The kudu took a step and started turning. It began to walk towards the woods. Shit! Collins swore silently. Can't shoot at moving game at this range. He relaxed his trigger finger as he tracked the animal, willing the bull to stop for a moment. As if obeying his command, the big male kudu quit walking and sniffed the air. The kudu was now facing away at a quartering angle, and a straight line from the muzzle of Collins's Model 70 would traverse over 3 feet of abdominal muscle before reaching the kudu's heart or lungs. Max Collins moved the crosshairs to a spot almost 3 feet over the kudu's back, then changed his mind. Spine's too small for this range. Too easy to miss altogether and just tear up the muscle. That Bowman kid said there'd be more than 4 feet of penetration with this round. Time to see if he really knows what the fuck he's talking about. Max altered his aim so that the crosshairs rested on a point slightly above the kudu's back, and a foot in front of the animal's right hip. It was what Elmer Keith referred to as a raking shot through the boiler room, and could be taken, especially on an animal as large as a greater kudu, only if the rifle and ammunition both being used gave truly outstanding penetration. Typical hunting rifles firing expanding bullets normally were good for between 12 and 18 inches of penetration on thin-skinned game. The crosshairs were describing a regular pattern as they moved within an imaginary 6-inch area containing Collins's aiming point. The rifleman got in sync with the movement, and the trigger broke just as the crosshairs passed through the spot Collins had selected. Perfect let-off, he thought as the muzzle blast rang out across the plain. Miss, Ray said. The bull was just standing there. No, Ray, here. Banda, the lead tracker, was staring through the binoculars, and he had seen dust fly from the hide in front of the kudu's right haunch. He bent over and jabbed his index finger at the corresponding spot on his own torso to illustrate. The tracker was grinning. He knew what was coming. The other animals in the herd began moving towards the trees when the sound of the shot reached them, but the big bull stood utterly still. 6 seconds later, he collapsed in a heap. Heart shot, Max said as he got to his feet. Either that or he died of fright. The guide, the client, and the 2 trackers started the quarter-mile walk to where the kudu lay. All 4 of them were smiling. So, was the first day up to your expectations? Ray and Max were relaxing by the campfire. Max was drinking scotch, while the younger man preferred gin. Damn, but I've never seen this much game, Max said with feeling. and I about shit myself when I saw that lion take down that buffalo. For Christ's sake. That morning they had seen a lion tear the throat from a Cape buffalo and hang on until it bled out. That was unusual for me too, Ray admitted. Usually they won't try it unless there are a pair of them that can attack at the same time. That one today must have been very hungry. As I point out to everyone who comes here for the first time, nothing in Africa dies of old age. He took a sip of his drink and stared into the glowing fire. I'm still thinking about the shot you made on that Kudu. 440 steps, through the paunch, and stopping just under the skin of the chest. My. Max smiled. I've been practicing a little. I've had other clients use the .338 Winchester, but nobody got penetration like you did with soft points. 4.5 feet, was it? I've got to give my nephew credit for that one. He's become the ballistician of the family. He thought I should bring a .375 Ackley, but I wanted a factory caliber for my plains rifle, just in case my ammo got lost and I had to buy some. I was gonna load up some solids for my .338 for big stuff like Elland, but he talked me out of it. Max was referring to ammunition loaded with bullets that had no lead exposed and did not deform at all on impact. Such projectiles penetrated much more deeply than expanding bullets. This was necessary on large game such as the Elland, which weighed over a ton. Henry loaded the stuff I brought on this trip. Max slid a round out of his cartridge belt and handed it to Ray Johnson for his inspection. That there is a 275-gram spear, he explained as Ray Johnson examined the round, referring to the weight and manufacturer of the copper and lead bullet projecting from the neck of the cartridge case. Elmer Keith sworn by him for years, Max added. Keith was the 70-year-old former outfitter and firearms authority from Salmon, Idaho. Ray Johnson nodded. Keith was well known to all serious hunters and guides. When Ray had lived in Pitkin County, he had corresponded with Keith on several occasions. Henry said the latest batch of 275s out of the factory would blow up. Said Spear got a bunch of complaints from deer hunters who didn't like them whistling through a muley like shit through a grouse, and they softened the core, hardened the gilding metal, and scored the inside of the jacket, if you can believe that. Henry hunted up a bunch of different lot numbers, sectioned and tested them all, and said this batch was good for more than 4 feet on game. Your nephew is a hunter then? Ray asked. Max Collins laughed at this question and took another sip of his scotch. Not quite. Henry's dying to get over here, though. He shoots a .375 Ackley like a varmint rifle. Must have put 6,000 rounds through that thing by now. Got a Rigby .577 double he's damn good with, too. And he's been looking for a 4-bore for going on 10 years now. But to answer your question, other than a few groundhogs he's potted out in the country, Henry's never been hunting. He'd rather shoot 10 crows in an afternoon than sit in a tree stand all weekend and wait for a deer to walk by. When he promised me I'd get more than 4 feet of penetration, I figured he'd tried the ammo out on wet newspapers or old phone books or something. Collins laughed harder at the memory. He was really fired up that I was going to Africa, though. Turned out and here Max had to get himself collected before he could continue. He conned some guy at the slaughterhouse into letting him paste a couple of their steers. Gave the guy a bottle of whiskey to go on break so Henry could autopsy him. Good Lord, Max! Ray said as he laughed along with the older man. You should have brought him along. I wish all my clients who'd never been hunting were like that. Well, I would've, but he's still in school right now. Henry's 16. Max's face lit up as he remembered something else. Henry got the whiskey from my sister's liquor cabinet because the store wouldn't sell him any, and had to get me to go buy another bottle to replace it before his mother found out. Well, you did, I hope, no? Shit, I ran out and bought him a case. Told him to work up some good Cape Buffalo loads for my .458. Ray Johnson found this comment to be uproariously funny. Despite it being only the first day of a 3-week safari, he decided that his earlier assessment of the man had been dead on. Max Collins was the best client he had ever had in his 6 years working as a professional hunter. New chapter here. Beginning on page 243 of the PDF edition and page 280 of the softcover hard printing, we have a new chapter. Chapter 81, Dangerous Game. June 12th, 1969. The three big bulls were by themselves, and since the wind was blowing away from them, they were unaware that Ray, Max, and the two trackers were nearby. They were all large, but the bull in front was definitely the biggest. 45 inches at least, Raymond thought. 17, maybe 1,800 pounds all told. Max Collins was carrying his dangerous game rifle, a custom .450 Ashurst built on a Czech Bruno ZKK 602 action. The Bruno was, in Max's opinion, the best of the Magnum Mausers. Kurt Benke had fitted the barrel and milled the trigger guard and oversized magazine that held 5 rounds. He had also reversed the operation of the safety. No simple task, so that it functioned in the same direction, forward for off, as the rifle made in every country other than Czechoslovakia did. Henry and Walter Bowman had made the stock to fit their big relative. The .450 Ashurst cartridge was made from a straightened .375 Holland & Holland case. It was basically a lengthened .458 Winchester that held more powder and could therefore be loaded to more powerful levels. The chamber was cut so that lower-powered .458 factory ammo could be used in a pinch, with only a slight loss in accuracy. "Take him," Raymond whispered. He didn't need to say which one. Collins threw the big rifle to his cheek and squeezed the trigger as soon as the front sight settled on the Cape Buffalo's shoulder. The muzzle blast of the .450 Ashurst cartridge made the 4 men's ears ring, and the buffalo dropped as if struck by a bolt of lightning. At 16 yards, Collins had put his shot within a quarter inch of where he was aiming, which was on the point of the animal's shoulder. The 500-grain steel-jacketed solid bullet had struck the buffalo at 2,460 feet per second, concentrating over 6,700 foot-pounds of energy onto an area smaller than a dime. Henry had correctly predicted exactly what would happen if Max were to get a broadside shot at a Cape Buffalo. The 500-grain Winchester solid was designed to go straight and maintain its shape no matter what it struck. The bullet shattered the buffalo's near shoulder, clipped the top of its heart, and smashed its off shoulder in a space of about 3 milliseconds. No 4-legged creature on Earth can remain standing with both shoulders shattered, and this one was no exception. There was another thing that Henry had predicted, but Max would not remember the boy's warning until several minutes later. A lot was going to happen before then. Max Collins racked the bolt of the Czech Mauser without dropping the rifle's butt from his shoulder, ejected the fired case, and chambered a new round before the dust had settled around the carcass of the 1,750-pound animal. Max knew that his bullet had done exactly what he had wanted, and that the buffalo he had shot was not a danger to them. But he did not lower his rifle. There were 2 other bulls less than 50 feet away, and the Cape Buffalo were known to charge at almost any time. They were especially known to charge when wounded, and that is exactly what the bull farthest from the 4 men did. The second bull, which weighed a mere 1,630 pounds, lowered his nose and headed straight at Max Collins. A charging Cape Buffalo at less than 50 feet presents a very challenging problem, particularly if the animal's head is lowered. A headshot, where the animal will die within 5 or 10 seconds, is simply not good enough. Man and lion both have all too often been killed by a dying Cape Buffalo in the last few seconds of its life. In order to survive a charge, the hunter must not only kill the animal, but make it collapse before it gets to him. Shoulder and spine shot do this, but are not possible from the front. The only shot that is certain to drop a charging buffalo instantly is one to the brain. This poses a problem, in that the animal's thick horn bosses cover much of the buffalo's skull and act as a very effective form of armor against any attempted brain shots. When the gold bead of the .450's front sight landed on the charging bull's head, Max Collins pulled the trigger and worked the bolt as the gun rose in recoil. He concentrated on his shooting and not on what might happen to him in the next few seconds. Max's shot on the charging bull was 2 inches higher and 1.25 inches left of where it should have been. It struck 1/4 inch above the corner of the sloping horn boss just left of center. The round nose of the Winchester bullet was deflected several degrees by the dense horn material. The bullet plowed through the horn boss on an angled path, glancing off the skull, cracking it slightly, and howled off over the Angolan countryside. In doing this, the impact of the bullet blew a baseball-sized chunk of horn material and a small amount of buffalo hide 50 feet in the air. It also made the bull considerably angrier in the process. The Cape Buffalo kept coming. Ray Johnson stepped to the side as he raised his 600 Nitro Holland & Holland, flicked off the safety, and prepared to try to stop the charge. Max Collins did not notice his guide's actions. He thought of nothing except working the bolt of his rifle smoothly, putting the front sight on the center of the buffalo's skull, and squeezing the trigger. His next shot on the charging beast was an inch lower than the last one. With the chunk of horn gone, the steel-jacketed slug bored right into the brain, deflected off the inside of the skull, and traveled down the center of the animal's spinal column for a distance of almost 3 feet. The buffalo fell on its chest and skidded to a stop less than 10 feet in front of Collins, who was racking the .450's bolt for yet another shot. The big buffalo was dead. It had died before its chin hit the ground, its brain destroyed and its spinal cord shattered by the steel-jacketed slug. Max looked over at Raymond, who lowered his 600 Nitro and engaged the safety. "Nice double, Max," Ray said with a grin. Max nodded, but didn't say anything right away. He was feeling just a little lightheaded after his exertions. "Thanks for holding off," he said finally. It felt good to drop the second one without any help. Raymond smiled. He had known that Max would want to stop the charge himself. The two men made jokes and laughed in relief after the charge, and then the guide noticed something. "I think I see why he charged, Max. Look." Ray was indicating the side of the dead buffalo's body, and Collins had to walk several yards to his right to see what the man was pointing at. 2 feet behind the shoulder was a fingernail-sized hole with a trickle of blood running out of it. Banda, the lead tracker, stepped over to the buffalo and inserted the thin blade of a skinning knife into the hole. The knife stopped after 3 inches of it had disappeared. "Your shot on the first one," Ray explained, broke both shoulders, exited, and went a couple inches into the bull standing directly behind him. Pissed him off, I'd say. "Well, I'll be a son of a bitch," Collins said. "My nephew told me that might happen, and I told him he was crazy. Serves me right." "I've seen it before with a .378 Weatherby," Ray Johnson admitted, "but never with a .45 caliber rifle. We'll make sure your next one doesn't have anything standing around behind it." Max Collins shook his head and laughed as he watched the trackers roll the buffalo on its side and prepare to gut it. "Damn, but it's good to be alive." The men were back in camp, eating the late dinner that the camp cook had prepared and reliving the excitement of the afternoon when Max suddenly thought of something. He put down his fork, finished chewing, and looked at Ray Johnson. "You know, that little bastard even told me he had a cure for it, but I didn't take him seriously." "What's that, Max?" "Over-penetration with solids in the .450. He loaded up some ammo for me in case I had that problem, and I thought he was kidding." "Soft points?" "No. We both thought those might not reach the second shoulder. Here, let me show you." Max Collins went to his tent and retrieved his ammo bag. He dug down to the bottom, found the ammo box he was looking for, and brought it back to the table. Ray took it from him and pulled off the lid. Inside were 20 .450 Ashurst cartridges, but the 500-grain steel-jacketed solids had been seated backwards into the brass cases. Instead of a rounded nose, the striking end of the bullet was completely flat and full diameter. "They're backwards," Raymond exclaimed. I thought it was a joke, but he insisted I bring them with me. He said he'd found some article where John Buchmiller tried it on elephant, and they killed better that way. Henry altered the feed ramp and re-throated my barrel for base first bullets, and he says his crazy loads shoot to the same point of aim at 50 yards. Said they bust up the shoulder bones on the slaughterhouse bulls better too. While I've never heard of doing that, John Buchmiller is a man I would listen to. Buchmiller was a Montana barrel maker who had won Montana's version of the Wimbledon Cup 1,000-yard match in both 1937 and 1938. He was an avid experimenter with a fondness for large calibers, who had first gone to Africa when he was in his 70s. Buchmiller had taken a liking to Africa, and gone on to work game control there, shooting hundreds of head of dangerous game while in his 80s. Henry Bowman corresponded with him regularly. 20 years later, flat-pointed, thick-jacketed .458 projectiles would be made by Jack Carter's Trophy Bonded Bullets Company. Trophy Bonded's Sledgehammer Solid would be considered by many African hunters to be the best slug ever made for Cape Buffalo. In 1969, however, the only shooters loading anything like it were an old Montana barrel maker and a 16-year-old from Missouri who liked to shoot big guns. I think I'll load these crazy-looking things in my 450 tomorrow, when we go out, Max said, examining one of the cartridges Henry had made up for him. Tell me more about this nephew of yours, Max, Ray said as he motioned for one of the camp crew to refill his drink. I have a sneaky feeling you've only given me the tip of the iceberg. New chapter here. Okay. We are presently on page 244 of the ebook edition and page 283 of the softcover hard printing. Chapter 82, Blue Tip, July 10th, 1969. 800 yards or little more. I make it to be, Alan Kane said after turning the thumb wheel to bring the halves of the split image into alignment. Let's see if the site subcontractor knew what he was doing, Henry Bowman replied with a grin. And the guys at Lake City Arsenal. Kane laughed as he looked up from the tripod-mounted 80-centimeter bar and Stroud rangefinder. Henry slid the rear sight of the 1945-era New England Westinghouse manufactured Browning automatic rifle to its 800-yard setting, checked to see that the bore was clear, made sure the wing nuts on the bipod were tight, and lay down behind the weapon. He put in his earplugs, snapped a full 20-round magazine into place, made sure the rate of fire selector was set to slow, and pulled the butt tightly against his shoulder. He aligned the front sight with the rock outcropping jutting out from the distant mountainside, and squeezed the trigger. 3 blasts chugged out of the 20-pound weapon, and 3 red streaks curved out over the valley and disappeared into the hillside a half-mile away. Windage looks good. You're about 8, maybe 10 feet low, Kane offered, peering through the huge 20-power Japanese battleship binoculars that were also mounted on a tripod. Shoot some more. Henry put 5 more bursts into the distant mountainside with very similar results. Tracers get lighter as they burn. Probably drop more. Yeah, that checks out, but you never know. Ball or AP might shoot somewhere else entirely. We'll find out after I shoot some more tracers. He adjusted his rear sight, then reached into the ammo can for another loaded magazine. He fired another burst, and the tracers bounced off the distant rock outcrop at unpredictable angles, burning out in midair as they tumbled. Henry Bowman loved tracer ammo. He fired 13 more 20-round magazines before standing up. Your turn. Give it a go, he said cheerfully as he picked up the 15 empty magazines and stacked them neatly on end in the 50 caliber ammo can. Now for the good stuff, Alan Kane announced as he lifted another 50 cal can off the tailgate of the truck. Blue tip. Kane lay down behind the automatic rifle and adjusted the gun's position. He was careful not to touch the barrel, which was now at a temperature of over 700 degrees Fahrenheit. He ensured that the bolt was retracted and snapped a loaded magazine of .30-06 ammunition into the bottom of the gun's receiver. Tracer ammunition enabled belt-fed machine gun shooters to see where their shots were going, especially at night. Standard military practice called for every 5th round in the belt to be a tracer, and the other 4 to be armor-piercing rounds whose bullets were constructed with pointed, hardened tungsten alloy cores for penetrating steel armor plate. Both tracer and armor-piercing .30 caliber ammo were common on the surplus market. Armor-piercing ammunition was easily recognized by the black paint on the tip of the bullet, while tracers were painted red or orange. During the Second World War, the United States of America had developed a .30 caliber incendiary round, and had started loading it in 1943. Incendiary ammunition explodes with a flash when it hits its target, and is most useful for igniting the fuel tanks of enemy aircraft. U.S. incendiary ammo is characterized by blue paint on the tip. Before the end of 1943, the United States military had realized that since A, none of their fighter aircraft carried .30 caliber machine guns, and B, the only time a .30 caliber ground gun was used in an anti-aircraft capacity was by utter coincidence, there was little use for .30 caliber incendiary ammunition. Consequently, they had stopped making it. Production of 50 caliber incendiary, and, to an even greater degree, silver-tipped, armor-piercing incendiary, was summarily increased. Blue-tipped .30 caliber ammunition, however, was only found with the 43 head stamp, signifying its production year of 1943, and was harder to come by. Blue tip was Henry and Alan's favorite. Alan Kane put the rear sight back on the 800-yard setting, took aim and squeezed off a 3-round burst. A little over a second later, 3 bright white flashes appeared at the base of the rock outcropping. They were easily visible even in the bright sunlight. Good windage. You're right at the base of the rocks. Nice tight group, too. Looks like all 3 were in about a 5-foot circle. That's the BAR for you. Alan Kane spent the next 20 minutes putting 3-shot bursts of 30-06 incendiary into the distant rocks, then picked up his Garand and took some long-range shots from the standing position with the World War II semi-auto. While Alan Kane was doing this, Henry Bowman got out his 8 3/8" 44 Magnum revolver, braced himself against the rear tire of Alan's truck, and did some half-mile 6-gun shooting. It took him 5 shots to determine the right amount of front sight to hold up to hit the Volkswagen-sized boulder a half-mile away. The sun was behind them, and Henry could easily spot the puffs of rock dust that flew up when the big cast slugs hit. After getting his sight picture down pat, Henry switched to a smaller rock, one about the size of an overstuffed armchair. He found that he could hit it 3 or 4 shots out of every cylinder. Gotta ration myself, he realized, when he saw how many fired cases had piled up already. Between us, we've only got maybe 15,000 rounds of 44 Magnum, and that has to last 3 weeks. He closed the lid of the ammo can, packed his empties into a canvas bag, and stood up. Henry stowed the ammo can and fired brass in a side compartment of the truck's camper top and went back to the giant binoculars to study the exposed rocks around him. He and Alan were on a very large section of federal land in the central part of Idaho, and the rock formations were different from those that Henry was used to seeing in Missouri. The Midwest was comprised of sedimentary deposits, which were evident along the river and anywhere on any interstate where the highway cut through a hill. Idaho had many more igneous formations, and Henry realized he was unconsciously classifying the geologic structures as he saw them. Henry enjoyed figuring things out, and he was just beginning to discover that geology offered limitless opportunities in that area. "What's that?" Henry asked when he realized Alan Kane had said something to him. "I said, let's pack up and head towards the Passamaroy Valley. See if Elmer was pulling our leg when he told us this was the big year in the Jack cycle." "Sounds good to me." Henry began to help Alan gather up their equipment, leaving the Browning until last to give it more time to cool. When they got in the cab of the truck and headed back down the mountain, the BAR was stowed in a felt-lined canvas drop case. Its barrel was still too hot to touch. New chapter here. Here on page 246 of the ebook edition and page 285 of the softcover hard printing, we have Chapter 83, Revolvers and Exploding Targets, July 15th, 1969. "How far out do you want them?" Henry asked nervously. "Whatever you think would make it interesting." "Great," Henry thought. "Put it all on me, why don't you?" He decided to spread the targets out over various ranges. 100 paces ought to do it for the close ones. I can hit those at least. He picked up the paper sack and started walking. Alan and Henry were 30 miles outside Salmon, Idaho. Elmer Keith was with them. When Keith had heard Alan Kane was coming to shoot jackrabbits, he had agreed to take an afternoon off from writing and do some long-range shooting with the Indiana ballistician and his young friend from Missouri. Alan and Henry had picked up the 70-year-old gunwriter at his house in Salmon, and Keith had directed Alan to a suitable spot outside the small town. Henry Bowman was nervous. Elmer Keith had been shooting revolvers for over 60 years, and he had studied and mastered many of Ed McGivern's aerial shooting feats 40 years prior. He was also the man who had persuaded Smith & Wesson to produce the .44 Magnum, and his book, 6 Guns, written when Henry was but 3 years old, was the definitive work on using the revolver for hunting and self-defense. An entire chapter of the book was devoted to shooting revolvers at ranges up to a half-mile. Henry Bowman had no desire to embarrass himself in front of Elmer Keith. In the paper sack Henry carried were 2 dozen 2-inch diameter sticks of 80% strength ditching dynamite. Alan had bought 4 cases of it at a truck depot in Mackay, on the drive north to Salmon. They had wrapped each stick with a piece of typing paper held on with tape and then given it a quick coat of fluorescent orange paint from a spray can for better visibility. Henry was walking out across the rocks and sagebrush to put the dynamite out at various ranges for the three of them to shoot at. When Henry had counted off 70 paces, he got nervous. Be pretty lame if I can't hit any of them. Better stick a few close in. He lay down 3 sticks several yards apart, making sure they could be seen from where Alan and Elmer were standing, and then kept walking. When Elmer Keith saw this, he raised his eyebrows but said nothing. Henry put 9 sticks 100 paces out, 6 at 150, and the final 6 at what he judged was 200 yards. When he got back to his 2 companions, the older man was smiling. 70, 100, 150, and 200, Henry announced. Why'd you stick those first 3 so close in? Kane demanded. So you could show us some hip shooting, Henry shot back. The old man laughed. Now this ought to split the real gun hands out from the ones should do their shooting across a table, Keith said around the side of his cigar. He was obviously amused. He tipped back the large 5X beaver Stetson that had been his trademark for over 40 years and looked closely at Henry. Go on, he said, nodding. Wonderful, Henry thought. Like we couldn't all shoot at the same time and make it a little less embarrassing. He slipped his earplugs in and went to the tailgate of the truck. He retrieved a .50 caliber can full of what he considered his match ammo. It had been loaded using once-fired cases and bullets Henry had cast out of the alloy he had found to be most accurate in Smith & Wesson revolvers. The bullet design was the Hensley & Gibbs No. 503, cast using the matched pair of molds his father had given him 5 years prior, lubricated with a 50% aloe and 50% beeswax mixture, and sized in straight-through star dies. Elmer Keith had designed the bullet in the late 1920s. They shot well at all distances. Henry Bowman put the ammo can at his feet and drew the 8 3/8 inch end frame from the cross-draw holster. He had sighted that particular gun to shoot 3 inches high at 100 yards. He loaded the cylinder, pulled the big 6-gun into the braced, 2-handed position, and cocked the hammer. The orange targets at the 150 step range were small, but not as hard to see as Henry had feared when he had put them out there. He put the front sight on the orange speck and made sure the top of the rear blade was even with the top of the gold insert in the front ramp. Henry increased the pressure on his right index finger and squeezed the final few ounces just as the front sight obscured the distant orange target. The big Smith bucked in recoil. Just over the top, Alan Kane said immediately. I think if you'd been a couple inches lower, you'd have hit it. Henry nodded and eared back the hammer for another try. This time he willed the trigger to break just before the front sight covered the orange dot in the distance. Immediately following the blast of the Magnum revolver came the distant, satisfying boom of the ditching dynamite, detonated by the impact of the 250-grain flat-nosed slug. A 10-foot cloud of dust appeared and began to settle at the spot where the charge had been. Without hesitating, Henry cocked the hammer again and loosed another round at the next charge set at the same distance. It exploded as well. Henry missed with his 4th shot, again going a bit high. He connected with his 5th, however, then switched to the 200-yard targets for the last round in his cylinder. I'm gonna try 200, he announced. He held up about a 1/16 of an inch on the front sight blade, put the target on top of it, and willed the gun to fire. Less than a foot to the right, Elmer Keith announced as Henry lowered his gun, opened the cylinder, and ejected the spent cases into his ammo pouch. Al, Keith said, addressing the man from Indiana, I guess young Henry here won't be calling me a liar about 6 guns at long range. Kane laughed, and Henry smiled at the compliment. Time to see if I've still got my eyesight, Keith announced, and drew a 4-inch barreled Smith & Wesson from an inside-the-pants holster on his right hip. It was identical to Henry's gun except for the shorter barrel and the smaller grips, which were inlaid on each side with an eagle medallion. Keith exploded the 3 remaining 100-yard charges with 4 shots, missed one at 150 yards, then connected with his last round. Henry noticed that Keith fired all 6 rounds in about half the time that he himself had taken. He is good. Henry thought. Leaving me the easy ones and the impossible ones, eh? Alan Kane said in mock indignation. We've got plenty of dynamite, Henry said cheerfully. The three shooters had spent the rest of the afternoon shooting a variety of long-range and aerial targets. Henry Bowman was especially impressed with what Alan Kane and Elmer Keith could each do with 2 revolvers, fired from the hip simultaneously. Keith, in turn, was surprised at Henry's skills on aerial targets, especially with his 20-pound BAR. Henry shook the man's hand once again as they dropped him off at his house. Thanks again for taking the time to see us today, Elmer, Henry said. Keith smiled. You got the right idea with that .375 Ackley of yours, son, he declared as he climbed out of the truck. No point in spending all your time practicing with a pest rifle like that 7mm Remington if you're ever gonna hunt real game animals. He turned and walked towards his house. Alan Kane waited until he had entered the front door, then accelerated away from the curb. Jesus, Henry thought. He's better than I am with a revolver. I need to practice more, Henry decided. New chapter here. The next chapter is chapter 84, entitled College Scouting Amherst, August 13th, 1969. This chapter starts at the start of page 248 of the ebook edition and page 288 of the softcover hard printing. However, as the subsequent few chapters pertain to Henry's activities at Amherst College, that shall be contained in one of the following audiobook recording session segments. At present, it is 12:14 p.m. on Wednesday, December 23rd, 2020. I do apologize for this taking so egregiously long. All things considered, I've been rather busy getting settled in with work, and frankly, it's been rather insane. I've had very, very little spare time. Fortunately, I'm moving into a new house that's closer to work for the new year, so that should grant me a little bit of extra time for recording or for other personal projects. I intend to continue with Unintended Consequences, and I also intend to continue with some of my other various recording projects. Additionally, I should add that I am presently looking into ways of monetizing my audiobook work, obviously not with potential copyright constraints in play, but with other possible projects. Regardless of which, I will continue this one, monetized or not, because I do find it quite interesting. If you would like to support my work, in order to ensure the continuation of various free projects, I am in the process of setting up a Patreon. As to other ways to support me, or if you would like to hire me on, I am in the process of setting up an account through ACX, which is Amazon's audiobook recording service. Elsewise, if you have anything you would like me to record, please send me a direct message with a quote. Thank you, and as always, have a wonderful day. Auf Wiedersehen.